They were ordinary students who walked into a basement and stepped into costumes. Some put on sunglasses and carried clipboards like batons. Some were stripped, assigned numbers, and told to obey. By nightfall, the costumes had ambitions, and the game stopped feeling like a game. What began as a study of roles became a rehearsal for cruelty, and then a performance nobody could stop. A handful of college volunteers were supposed to simulate life in a prison, yet within days the simulation swallowed the players. This is the story of the experiment that promised to show how roles remake people, and how people under pressure can forget they are still people. It began with about 24 students screened for mental health, randomly assigned to be guards or prisoners. The guards were given uniforms, mirrored shades, and permission to maintain order, with vague instructions that encouraged toughness without offering clear limits. The prisoners were arrested at home, booked and numbered, then delivered to a mock jail built in a university basement, where lights never dimmed and rules multiplied like vines. The plan was to run for 2 weeks, to observe how ordinary individuals adapt to assigned roles, to see whether situation outweighs personality. The result was 6 days of escalating humiliation, sleep disruption, and petty tyranny, punctuated by breakdowns that seemed to bloom like bruises. In one scene that has become legend, a prisoner refused to come to the yard, and guards answered not with measured discipline, but with creative degradation. Push-ups became punishments, rights became privileges, and names dissolved into numbers that sounded like gravel in the mouth. The experiment stopped not because the design said stop, but because someone witnessed a midnight inspection and asked a simple human question. What are you doing to these people? That question, like a light snapped on in a dark room, revealed how far the simulation had drifted from any ethical shore. For many viewers, the takeaway was painfully clear. When people wear a powerful costume and the system winks at cruelty, cruelty learns to walk on its own. The guards were not monsters, at least not at the start. They were students who learned that their new role rewarded domination and punished hesitation. The prisoners were not naturally submissive. They were students who learned that resistance meant suffering, and suffering seemed to have no appeal process. Roles are not just titles printed on badges. Roles are scripts that come with stage directions written into the walls. If the wall says you are in charge, your lines begin to harden, and your voice imitates authority you have not yet earned. If the wall says you have no power, your lines become shorter, and you stop making eye contact with your own reflection. The experiment has been celebrated because it dramatized how the situation can be stronger than the individual. It has been criticized because parts of the drama may have been coached, and the situation may have been tilted to produce a headline. Researchers played the roles of prison officials, which blurred the line between observer and director, and their hints about toughness may have scripted the guards more than admitted. Some guards reported feeling pushed to be harsh, which raises the possibility that demand characteristics, not pure role adoption, drove the story forward. Later attempts to reproduce the chaos did not always ignite such flames, and a televised study in Britain showed groups negotiating rather than descending immediately into abuse. Historians and methodologists have combed through recordings and notes, and some have argued that the legend oversimplifies complex social dynamics. They point out that not all guards behaved cruelly, and that leadership among the prisoners shifted, suggesting that human agency never fully disappeared. They remind us that small samples, theatrical settings, and researcher expectations can bend outcomes as surely as any baton. We should hear those critiques seriously, because science earns trust by welcoming tough questions and resisting tidy morality plays. Yet even with those flaws illuminated, the experiment still casts a long shadow across modern life. Because the core lesson survives the controversy, like a ship survives a storm, battered but afloat. Systems shape choices, and choices accumulate into character, especially when power meets low accountability and high ambiguity. Think about the new manager who inherits a team and adopts the previous boss's cold style because the metrics only reward speed, not kindness. Think about a hospital unit where the forms pile higher than faces, and an overworked nurse starts calling patients the hip replacement rather than the man who misses his garden. Think about a college group chat where anonymity loosens tongues, sarcasm sharpens, and suddenly the joke becomes a shove without fingerprints. Think about customer support scripts that frame callers as obstacles, not people, and watch the patients bleed from voices as if pulled by gravity. In each case, the costume is not cloth, but context, woven from titles, dashboards, rules, and rumors. Authority corrupts most reliably when it floats in the open sea, without buoys like transparency, oversight, and a culture that rewards apology over swagger. Unchecked authority also shrinks the moral imagination of those underneath it. Because survival starts to feel like complicity's cousin, you tell yourself you are just following policy, while policy quietly edits your sense of right and wrong. You tell yourself the target deserved it, Because dehumanization offers a cheap relief from cognitive dissonance. Dehumanization does not start with shouting. It starts with naming. When names become numbers, when faces become files, when communities become segments, empathy leaks away through the cracks. The experiment's prisoners lost their names and their bearings, and the guards learned to see compliance as a victory, not as a warning sign. The human struggle inside any system is not simply to obey or rebel. It is to remain a person, while playing a part. That struggle is familiar to anyone who has worn a uniform, carried a company laptop, or held the keys to a digital dashboard. We think we capture roles like tools, but roles can capture us back, especially when our peers reward the captured version more than the careful one. You may recognize this if you have ever laughed along in a meeting where mockery passed as culture, even though your stomach tightened. You may recognize this if you have ever ignored a questionable charge because the numbers looked good and the deadline growled. You may recognize this if you have ever muted a colleague who raised uncomfortable questions because your task list felt like a fire that wanted more wood. So what can we do if roles can bend us and systems can fold us into shapes we never wanted? First, we can name the role before it names us by asking which script we are about to read from and who wrote it. When you take a new position or join a new group, write a short pledge about the person you refuse to stop being and keep it where policy cannot reach. Second, we can build structures that help good intentions survive bad days. Rotate responsibilities that grant unilateral power, so no single person becomes the permanent gatekeeper of dignity. Give every team an ombudsperson with real authority to pause decisions when human consequences look hazy. Use audits that count not just outcomes but also the means used to get there, because method is a moral truth, hiding in plain sight. Third, we can engineer friction that slows dehumanization before it accelerates. Replace labels with names in dashboards and emails, even when templates insist on codes. Start meetings with a minute of silence to remember the people affected by your work, because silence can recalibrate the compass without wasting a second. Practice the sentence, "Help me see the person here," and use it whenever the conversation turns clinical. Fourth, we can develop what psychologists sometimes call moral courage, which is less about heroic acts and more about repeated small refusals. Refuse to laugh when the joke punches down. Refuse to rush a decision that will harm someone who cannot push back. Refuse to use authority to settle frustration that should be faced, not exported. Fifth, we can invite accountability that feels like community rather than surveillance. Create buddy systems where colleagues debrief difficult calls, not to blame, but to ask what the role tried to make us do. Encourage dissent as a professional duty, not a personality flaw, and reward the person who points out a blind spot before it becomes a scandal. Sixth, we can design for reversibility, because the easiest ethical decisions are the ones we can unmake tomorrow. When policies threaten to reduce people to categories, add an escape hatch that allows reconsideration when context contradicts the category. When punishment tempts us with efficiency, split it into smaller steps that allow mercy to appear without loss of face. Seventh, we can rehearse humanity the way athletes rehearse muscle memory. Use first names, tell brief stories, and ask one question that does not serve the transaction. Because warmth is not an accessory in hard systems. It is an instrument. In online spaces, anonymity does not have to be a mask for cruelty if community norms are explicit and consistently enforced by many hands, not one heavy hand. Slow-mode chats, limited reposts, and reflection prompts are structural tools that cue better behavior without any sermon. In workplaces, small rituals can repaint the walls. Leaders can model apology, not as a brand strategy, but as an act of repair that restores the individual under the uniform. Peer recognition can spotlight acts of care alongside wins, so the costume learns to flex around the person, not crush them. Education can show students simulations of power with built-in breaks and debriefs, so they feel the shaping force without getting trapped by it. The goal is not to abolish roles, because roles coordinate complex worlds, and they allow airplanes to land safely and hospitals to move swiftly. The goal is to create roles that remember they are tools in human hands, not spells that turn hands into hammers. We also owe it to the people who lived through the basement study to hold more than one truth at once. The truth that some elements were manipulated, and that science deserves better methods and cleaner boundaries. The truth that even one coerced humiliation in the name of knowledge is too many, and that ethics committees exist to protect the living subject and the future witness. And also the truth that the study holds a mirror to patterns we still live with, where unchecked power teaches ordinary people extraordinary callousness. When we hold multiple truths together, our understanding becomes less dramatic, but more durable. It becomes a compass that points not to shock but to responsibility. You and I cannot redesign every institution tomorrow, but we can redesign the small systems we inhabit today. We can make our teams places where rules serve people, not the other way around. We can treat our titles like umbrellas that keep the rain off others, rather than swords that keep others in line. We can ask 3 questions before we act with authority. Who benefits and who bears the cost? And can we face those people? What would we do if a camera were rolling? And would we be proud to replay the footage? If the person affected were someone we loved, what would we choose differently? Those questions do not guarantee heroism, but they prevent sleepwalking, because cruelty often thrives not on hatred, but on autopilot. And autopilot is a comfort we can choose to interrupt. The Stanford basement is a time capsule and a caution sign, a flawed artifact that still radiates a warning worth heeding. It reminds us that systems write scripts, scripts train habits, and habits define how someone else experiences us. It reminds us that we must train our roles to bow to our values, rather than training our values to kneel before our roles. It reminds us that integrity is not made of big moments only, but of many small resistances performed on ordinary days. So ask yourself where you might be wearing a costume that encourages you to forget a name. Ask yourself where your authority could use a seatbelt and a speed limit, not because you distrust yourself, but because you respect the people around you. Ask yourself where your team could build structures that make the kind choice the easy choice, because ease is the engine of most human behavior. In the end, the experiment's dramatic scenes are less important than the everyday sequel we each direct at work, at home, and online. We choose whether our roles become cages or frames, and whether our titles make us larger or smaller inside. We choose whether to play to an audience of fear or to an audience of conscience, and we choose whether to remember that the person across from us is more than the category our system assigned to them. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Beware the costume that begins to wear the actor, because the roles we play can grow so strong that they forget we were meant to be the ones holding the mask.